Welcome to TH Stories 80, where stories take shape, from fanfiction in worlds like Game of Thrones, Naruto, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Stargate SG-1, to chilling urban legends and eerie tales. There's always something to keep you listening. If you enjoy captivating storytelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Now, let's begin Born into Darkness. Previously on Born into Darkness. Faith has been in Colorado Springs for a few days. She's now a waitress at O'Malley's, where she meets Colonel O'Neill, Major Carter, Teal'c, and Daniel. While serving the members of SG-1, Faith notices people from a Watchers Council assassination squad. She tries to flee. SG-1 notice the men too and take note. Faith leaves through the back but is ambushed by another team. When the council's men in the restaurant leave, SG-1 follows them. They find Faith being attacked in an alley. They intervene and defeat the assassins. One of them is knocked unconscious, but Faith is stabbed. While distracted in helping Faith, the men escape, leaving behind the unconscious one. Faith is brought back to the SGC due to the strength she displayed in the fight. She could have been a Goa'uld, or alien technology could have been used to enhance her physiology. After a panel was run, Major Carter learns the girl is really her daughter, Ellie, the girl who she thought had been stillborn so many years ago. How is that even possible? And now the continuation. Isolation Room 1, 11:30 hours. General Hammond could only stare at Major Carter with his mouth wide open in surprise. The blonde officer reveals something no one in the SGC even suspected, that she had a daughter, or in this instance, has a daughter. He watched Carter brush the back of her fingers along the young woman's cheeks while holding tight onto her hand. Hammond wondered why his friend, Jacob Carter, never mentioned his own daughter was pregnant. It was then Hammond came to a realization, upon which he gently placed a hand on the Major's shoulder. "Major," Hammond said gently, "does Jacob know?" The blonde officer wiped her eyes before releasing Faith's hand, after which she glanced at the monitors. Her breathing was normal, her oxygen levels were normal, her heart rate was normal, and her blood pressure was normal. Carter then turned towards the general and shook her head to his earlier question in regard to Jacob's knowledge of her pregnancy. At the same time, she wiped even more of her tears. Hammond nodded his head. This news would definitely come as a shock to Jacob, he thought to himself. "Come, Major," he said, gently turning Carter around. "Let her get some rest. In the meantime, I'll have Dr. Frazer run the test once again, while we use other avenues to find out who she really is." Yes, sir," Carter whispered. Her shoulders trembled as she turned around once again, her eyes taking in the view of an unconscious Faith. Carter felt as if Faith's body would vanish if she didn't keep an eye on her. As she stared, Carter whispered, "I didn't notice it before." "How couldn't I notice? What kind of mother does that make me?" "Major," said the general gently. Carter, her eyes red, tears continuing to well up, turned towards him and pressed her lips together. Hammond said, "We'll get to the bottom of this. Come with me to the briefing room. We'll get you some coffee and some time to gather your thoughts. But I know this may be too much to ask, but we need to know everything, from the beginning." "I understand, sir," the Major answered. She glanced at Faith once again. My Ellie's alive." The general then gently guided her to the blast doors and pressed a button. The door slid open to reveal a very concerned SG-1 with Dr. Frazer standing close by. Carter avoided looking into the eyes of her colleagues, while Hammond asked Dr. Frazer to run another blood test in case the first one was wrong. "I already have, sir," said Dr. Frazer. She nodded her head at the general before approaching Carter. She gently placed a hand on Carter's shoulder before saying, "The second test would most likely have the same result." In front of the rest of SG-1, the doctor didn't mention the girl was Carter's daughter. She nodded her head at Hammond before walking off to the infirmary. She wanted to remind the lab that Carter's sample was the highest priority. Colonel O'Neill had been silently studying the interaction between both the Major and the red-haired doctor. When the latter walked away, Carter wrapped her arms around herself. He then recalled Carter's tear-filled eyes when she ran out of Dr. Frazer's office. How did Carter know Anne? Could the girl in the isolation room be related to the Major somehow? Could she be a long-lost cousin? Or maybe a long-lost younger sister? No, thought the Colonel to himself as he glanced at Daniel and Teal'c. He could tell they were brimming with questions, especially Daniel, but were gentlemanly enough to know that their friend and colleague was upset. He then glanced back towards the Major, who was now standing next to General Hammond, and thought, if she had a sister, then we'd know about it. So, a cousin, maybe? A long-lost cousin? Colonel O'Neill. Hammond's voice brought the Colonel out of his thoughts and into the real world. Anne's fingerprints were taken this morning and submitted for a background check. I'd like to know who she really is. Yes, sir, replied Colonel O'Neill, who then looked back at the Major, who was avoiding his gaze. Confused, the Colonel nodded his head and rushed up towards the elevator lobby. The General then turned towards Daniel. Hammond told him and Teal'c to head directly to the motel where, according to the manager at O'Malley's, Anne was staying. Hammond told them that he'd have the local police meet them at the motel. I'll tell them that the young woman broke into a military facility, and I will specify the case as ours, Hammond said before he glanced over in Major Carter's direction. She simply nodded her head. The General then turned to Daniel and Teal'c before telling them to get to it. All of them had their jobs to do. We'll check out the motel, General, said Daniel before turning towards Major Carter, who had her head down. Sam, are you... I'm okay, Daniel, said the Major, looking back up and then giving the man a small smile. However, she just wanted to go somewhere where she could be alone. She just wanted to have a good cry. Major Carter, said Teal'c as he approached the blonde officer. The Jaffa knew something was wrong, that the Major was being uneasy about something. So, he decided not to say anything else. He would wait for the blonde officer to tell them everything in due course. The big man just bowed his head before he and Daniel left to change into their civilian clothes. After everyone had left, the General walked with Major Carter towards the briefing room. He told her that he needed to make the call to the local police, and then they would sit over a cup of coffee in his office and talk about everything. The Sunlight Motel, Colorado Springs, 1200 hours. It didn't take too long for the car to drive up to the parking lot of the 3-story Sunlight Motel. After parking his car, Daniel and Teal'c stepped out and then strode towards a man leaning against a blue sedan, his suit parted to show his badge attached to his belt. Hello, said Daniel, approaching him with Teal'c. My name's Dr. Daniel Jackson. I think you were expecting us. Yes, the man replied, extending his hand towards Daniel. I'm Detective Monroe. My captain wanted to make sure you guys get what you need. Thanks, replied Daniel. The young woman's name is Anne Renning, and apparently she lives here. So we need to check her room for any classified materials and identification, since we have reason to believe she's using an alias. Why would she use an alias? Asked the detective as he walked towards the main office next to Daniel, Teal'c following close behind. If you are going to break into a military base, said Daniel, wouldn't you use an alias and fake ID? Point taken, said the detective before he talked to the elderly man behind the counter in the main lobby. It had taken some convincing by the detective, and the threat that he knew exactly what was going on in the motel before the man handed Anne's keys to them. After they walked out of the office, Teal'c asked Detective Monroe what he meant when speaking to the elderly man. At the first question, the detective looked at Daniel, who told him that Murray was visiting from out of town. "This is one of the seedier motels in town," said Detective Monroe as he led the pair up the stairs. "It's extremely affordable and, well, it plays host to a lot of unsavory activities. Places like this stay on like cockroaches. They are very hard to kill off." Once the group reached the second floor, they made a left turn towards room 234 and then swiped the key card into the panel on the door until the electronic lock clicked. The detective opened the door, looked around the room to make sure it was empty, and then nodded at Daniel. The detective said he'll wait for them outside. Daniel nodded his head before entering the room with Teal'c. There was one bed, a large purse on a table with 2 chairs in the corner, a TV on an entertainment center, some clothes on the floor near the foot of the bed, and a bare closet. The table also had a map of Colorado Springs, which was marked up with blue ink, and that was it. "There's nothing here. She must have just moved in," Daniel said while looking around the room while Teal'c stepped into the washroom. "Daniel Jackson," Teal'c intoned. Daniel stepped into the washroom as Teal'c picked up the waste bin. There were clumps of dark brown hair along with boxes of hair coloring. "Hair," said Daniel as he looked inside the bin, "so we know she's not a real blonde." Daniel and Teal'c stepped out and then walked towards the purse on the table. Daniel motioned towards the purse. "Maybe this will have more information." Daniel opened the purse and then dumped the contents on the table. There were a lot of things spread out on the table, some of which Daniel picked up after putting away the purse. There were 2 pieces of ID among the items. "Faith Lehane," said Daniel as he read the ID. "She has a South Boston address. Her hair color is different, and it's longer on the ID, but looks like our girl. The name could still be an alias though." Daniel then handed Faith's ID to Teal'c before examining the other ID. Hummed Daniel. "This ID is for a Tara Maclay, address in Sunnydale, California. Issued 2 months ago." "Daniel Jackson," Teal'c called out after he put away Faith's ID and was now examining some receipts. He handed the receipts to Daniel. Daniel read through each one while saying, "These are gas station receipts dating back a few days. Looks like the earliest is from Sunnydale." Teal'c looked through the purse once again before taking out some cash. "Daniel Jackson, there is $800 hidden in one of the pockets." Daniel nodded. Teal'c placed the money back into the bag. Daniel swept his gaze across the room before saying, "Let's put everything back into the purse. We'll take it and the box of hair coloring with us." "Daniel Jackson," Teal'c said while returning all the items into the purse, "is Sunnydale located very far from Colorado?" "Yes," said Daniel, his eyes widening when he realized what Teal'c meant. They searched the room once again, but were unable to find any bus or plane tickets. So how did she travel to Colorado Springs? She didn't have a car. According to the old manager, Faith walked up the road to the motel. Yet, there were the receipts from gas stations in the purse, showing she must have been driving. If not driving, she would have been in a car at some point. Walking wasn't a possibility. It would take several days, and the timelines didn't match up. Teal'c asked if Faith could have shared a ride. Daniel said it was possible. They didn't even know if Faith has a car. "Only thing we can do is ask Faith when she wakes up," Daniel said. Carrying the purse in his hand, Daniel told Teal'c, "Right, let's get back to the SGC. Do you believe that Major Carter knows this woman?" asked Teal'c. I think so, Daniel said softly, but I have no idea how. Briefing room, SGC, an hour later. Major Carter was in the briefing room looking out the window to the Stargate below. She had always imagined that, if Ellie were alive, that she would have gone with her to DC when she took up her posting at the Pentagon. Carter believed Ellie would have been happy. Ellie would have gone to school there, and since Carter's job had consisted of relatively regular hours, she would be there for Ellie while she grew up. Carter would have been able to make up for the time she lost with her daughter. Ellie's loss nearly destroyed Carter. She was prepared to quit the academy, but her Aunt Betty convinced her the right thing to do would be to go to the academy and make Ellie proud of her mother. Make her proud of you, Sammy. The Major could still hear the older woman's voice in her head as she recalled the day Ellie was buried. After a few months of being depressed, Carter knew in her soul that Betty was right. Ellie would be disappointed in her if she gave up. So, after making the decision to attend the academy, Samantha would always visit the baby she buried. At the academy, the then cadet Carter excelled at everything she did, eventually graduating with top honors. She was obsessed with being the best officer she could be. Also, her daughter would be proud of her. Carter got her master's and then her PhD. She flew in the Gulf War. Then she joined the Pentagon and was a vital part of the team that eventually built the dialing computer for the Stargate program. Then she eventually joined the program she helped create as a member of its premier team. But now, everything around her started to feel different. The young woman lying unconscious in the isolation room was her daughter. The very same daughter who died. Her daughter who was still born into this world. She still remembered that day like it was yesterday. The honest truth is that even Major Carter, for all her genius, didn't know what would have happened if Ellie lived that fateful day. Maybe I would have changed my mind, thought Carter to herself, hearing familiar voices from down the hallway leading to the briefing room. Maybe I would have decided to go to college instead of the academy, so that I could be closer to Ellie. Maybe, there are so many maybes, but Ellie's alive. How can she be alive when I saw her body? I remember she wasn't breathing. She wasn't moving. I need answers. I need to talk to Ellie. I need to... Sam? Said Daniel as the Major shook her head and wiped the tears welling up in her eyes before turning to look at Daniel. He stepped into the briefing room and then placed a large purse onto the table while Teal'c gave her a respectful bow. Daniel, Teal'c, she said, looking at them with hope etched on her face. Did you find anything on Anne? Yes, we found a few things, Sam, Daniel replied. Carter wondered what Daniel could have found. She tried to lower her expectations. She needed to wait for news. She hoped her daughter had a good life at least. General Hammond walked into the briefing room from his office before telling everyone to take a seat. He mentioned Dr. Frazer and Colonel O'Neill were already on their way down. The general then asked everyone to take a seat before giving Major Carter a small smile. They took their seats as another series of footsteps came down the hallway. Sir, Major, said Dr. Frazer as she nodded at General Hammond and then at Carter before she went to sit next to her. Frazer sat and then placed a file on the table in front of her. In the meantime, O'Neill sat next to General Hammond while Daniel sat across from Carter and Teal'c sat next to Colonel O'Neill. Major, the general leaned forward. I know this is hard for you, but would you tell the others what you told me? Yes, sir, Carter replied as Dr. Frazer closed her eyes. The latter held tightly to the file in front of her. afraid of how her best friend would react. "When I was 16," said the Major, before taking in a deep breath. She, she slowly exhaled and then spoke. I I had a daughter." "Carter?" asked Colonel O'Neill, who was surprised at the Major's confession. Her eyes were lowered. She was staring at the table. O'Neill, with his mouth hanging open in surprise, glanced at the equally shocked looks on Daniel and Teal'c before he shifted his gaze towards General Hammond. The General nodded his head before telling everyone to let the Major finish her story. The Colonel nodded his head and then turned towards Major Carter, who looked up at him. She silently looked away again as she placed her arms on the table and just stared at her hands. She then spoke. "My plan was to give full custody of her to my boyfriend at the time," the Major said as she looked at Daniel, who had a horrified expression on his face. She knew that he'd be most affected by her story, since he lost his parents when he was just a boy. He had also spoken about his grandfather, who refused to take him in before being placed into the foster care system. Carter continued, "But Ron didn't want anything to do with her. I didn't want to tell my dad because I didn't want him to be disappointed in me. I mean, I was accepted into the academy and I was pregnant. I had no idea what he'd say, and so I was scared." She breathed in and out once again before continuing. "Then I approached my Aunt Betty. She was working at the Colorado Springs Department of Children and Families, and I asked her if she could take full custody of my baby, at least until I graduated from the academy. Then I could take custody of her again. I would do everything in my power to be a good mother and try to atone for abandoning her. I would have told my dad about her too. Can you imagine his shock and surprise when he learns he has a granddaughter? Can you imagine Mark's surprise when he finds out that he has a niece?" The Major wiped her eyes as her voice broke before she coughed and continued talking. Wiping her eyes again, she looked up and told them that none of that happened. "I named her Ellie," Carter said with a faraway look in her eyes. "Ellie Carter. Named her after my mother, Eleanor." "Jacob and your brother would have been proud," the General said, before Carter laughed a bit while she wiped her eyes. She then lifted her eyes off her hands and looked at Daniel, Teal'c, and Colonel O'Neill. "It could have been different. It could have been so different," she whispered. "Carter?" asked the Colonel when he saw the Major wiping her eyes again. She breathed deeply a few times. "The day of the delivery," Carter continued with her story. She was stillborn." "What?" Daniel was shocked, leaning forward, his eyes on Carter. She, in turn, looked back at him with tears welling up in her eyes. Daniel said, "Sam, I'm so sorry." The Colonel and Teal'c could only look at each other and then at Carter. O'Neill closed his eyes and leaned back on his seat. Out of all of them, he knew what it's like for a parent to outlive a child, but to lose the baby at birth. "I'm so sorry, Carter," he thought. "I am sorry, Major Carter," said Teal'c as she nodded her head. "Me too, Carter," said Colonel O'Neill. "But what does this have to do with the girl in the isolation room?" "That's where it gets complicated," said Dr. Frazer, glancing at Carter, who was wiping her eyes before returning her attention to everyone else. "The young woman? Anne? She's the Major's daughter." "What?" both Colonel O'Neill and Daniel said together. They stared at Frazer, who nodded her head, and then at Carter, and then back at Frazer once again. Teal'c was staring at the General and then at Carter with a perplexed look. O'Neill then added, "How is that possible?" She wasn't moving, said the Major softly. My Aunt Betty was with me. We didn't see Ellie move. We didn't hear her make any noise after she was born. It nearly destroyed me. If she lived, maybe I would have changed my mind and done things differently. My aunt convinced me to make Ellie proud and attend the academy. And that's what I did. Now this girl is in the isolation room, and Janet's test shows that she's Ellie. She's my daughter. I don't know how or why, but she's my daughter. The initial test I ran is the gold standard, but I'm running a new DNA test using the hair Daniel and Teal'c brought back, said Dr. Frazer as the shocked members of SG-1 looked at her. She took in a deep breath before saying, and that's not all. Dr. Frazer? Asked the general, staring at Frazer, who was holding tight to the folder in front of her. Sam, said the doctor, turning towards the major. I am so sorry. Janet? Asked Major Carter. What's wrong? Janet? Anne, the doctor said. Just then, O'Neill put his hand up, interrupting her. As he did so, he took out 3 pieces of folded paper from his pocket. Colonel? Asked the general. Her background check, said the colonel, pointing at the pieces of paper in his hand. According to the fingerprints, her name's Faith Lehane. Faith, asked Daniel as he grabbed the purse while Major Carter looked on. He opened it and rummaged through before taking out an ID. He passed it along to Colonel O'Neill while asking, This Faith Lehane? The colonel took the ID and compared it to the picture of the young woman on the first piece of paper. He nodded his head before passing it along to General Hammond, who then passed it on to Major Carter. The only reason we got a hit, said the colonel as he glanced at Major Carter, who brushed her fingers on Faith's ID picture, is because there's a missing persons bulletin out on her. It was filed when she was 13 by an Officer Rizzoli of the Boston PD. So she's really from South Boston? Asked Daniel as he watched Carter stare at the picture of the long dark-haired young woman on the ID. Frazer gently placed her hand on the major's shoulder. In turn, Carter leaned back and closed her eyes. Yeah, said the colonel, looking at the papers and then at Dr. Frazer, to the general, and then back to Major Carter. But, Carter, if she's your daughter, even if we don't know how she's alive, I think I shouldn't continue. She died, sir, said the major softly. I have her certificate of stillbirth in my safe deposit box, along with some ultrasound scans of her. If this is her, I'd like to know how she's alive. And I need to know that... please, continue. General, said the colonel, handing the papers to General Hammond, who skimmed through it and then looked back at the colonel in shock. He quickly recovered. He turned towards Carter. Major, the general said, his gaze dropping to the paper in his hand. Faith Lehane's parents are listed as George Patrick Lehane and Sabrina Lehane. The father's been to jail multiple times for assault, abuse, and he's currently serving life in prison for murder. What? Whispered a very horrified Carter. No, there's no way. Sir? Said Daniel before General Hammond handed him the papers. Carter was massaging her forehead as Daniel read out, Sabrina Lehane, arrested on charges of child abuse, prostitution, and alcohol-related offenses. She was arrested a day before the missing persons went out. Oh God, Carter said, standing up and then moving over to the window overlooking the Stargate. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Colonel O'Neill stood up and walked after her. Carter continued to whisper, "Oh God, oh God. What? Who would?" "Carter," said the colonel, while the other men could only sit in shock. Frazer walked up to both O'Neill and Carter and then placed a hand on the major's shoulder. "Sam," Frazer said. She nodded at O'Neill, but then took a few steps back. She continued, "Things are going to get much harder to hear. She lived her life as Faith Lehane, and I don't know if you will ever get the girl you thought of as Ellie back. There's a lot more." "She's my daughter, Janet," said the major. "Faith or Ellie, she's my daughter. I need to know everything that happened to her. Please. I need to know." Frazer nodded her head and then led the major back to her seat. In the meantime, O'Neill stared out the window as Dr. Frazer started to talk about her findings. Colonel O'Neill closed his eyes and rolled his hands into fists as Dr. Frazer revealed the full extent of what happened to Faith. As she spoke, a deadly silence permeated the room. "A lot of calcifications," said the doctor. "She had broken bones in various places, broken fingers, microfractures on her shoulder blades, a scar on her abdomen that indicated she was stabbed, the stab wounds from her most recent attack, but I haven't done a check on any sexual abuse. But if on Teal'c," Teal'c said, hiding his outrage, "any Jaffa that harms a child would be subject to death. Usually it would be the father or a male of the blood family who would punish the wrongdoer. You do not have this on earth." "No," Daniel said softly, his eyes on the table. Carter had her hands covering her face. The general didn't say anything. When Dr. Frazer stopped talking, the room was completely silent once again. Then General Hammond was the one who first spoke. "Major," the general said. The blonde officer wiped her eyes and then looked at him. She was doing her best not to break down or vomit after what she just heard. "You said you have Ellie's certificate." "I do." "Yes, sir," she replied. "All right," Hammond said. "I want you to hold that for now. In the meantime, I will be having SG-1 leave tomorrow for the meeting with the Tolan in regards to the treaty." "But sir," said Daniel as he sat up. Before he could say anything further, the general spoke up. "This is not up for debate," Hammond said. "I'd like Major Carter to remain on Earth. As for the rest of you, this treaty is extremely important. Is that understood? Jack?" "Yes, sir," replied O'Neill, nodding his head. There was a time limit to his secret mission. Rogue NID operatives were stealing technology from their allies, including the Tolan and the Asgard. The Asgard had tasked the SGC to capture those responsible, asking specifically for Colonel O'Neill. The treaty with the Tolan was the first stage of a carefully laid out plan, and as he went through the plan in his mind once again, the colonel knew Carter needed to be with her daughter. "Jack," said Daniel, disbelief in his voice. "Daniel," said the colonel, "we have our orders. In the meantime, Carter and Faith or Ellie will be all right." "Major Carter," Hammond turned towards the blonde officer, "I have to ask you not to reveal your relationship with the young woman. At least not yet. The primary reason being, we don't know what really happened to her, or how it happened, or who stole her from you. We also don't know who came after her yesterday, or if they'll try again. Until we know all those things, I need you to... I'm sorry, but I need you to not Tell her who you really are. In the meantime, she'll stay in the SGC for her own protection." "I understand, sir," replied the Major. "Back at the motel," said Daniel, reaching into the large purse. He took out the other ID as well as the receipts. "We found Ellie had another ID in her possession, that of Tara Maclay, as well as a receipt from a gas station in a city called Sunnydale. It was dated only a few days ago. Then there was this." Daniel handed the Sunlight Motel receipt to the Major, who looked at it and then at everyone else. "She checked in only a few days ago," asked the Major, and then looked at the guest receipt. "Before that, she was in Sunnydale." "So she stayed there?" asked Dr. Frazer. "Looks like it," said Major Carter, before she turned to the General and asked him for permission to check out Sunnydale and then talk to Tara Maclay. Before all of that, she would call the officer who filed the missing persons report to find out how Faith came to be with the Lehanes. "I'm sure that Tara would know others who know Faith. Sir, I would like to request a few days of personal leave. And if your daughter awakens?" "I'll take care of her, sir," said Dr. Frazer. "With her injuries, she can't move for a few days." "Major Carter," said Teal'c, "how do you intend to find Faith Lehane's living area in Sunnydale?" "She stayed in a motel here," said Major Carter. "I'll take her ID with me and search every motel in Sunnydale if I have to." Won't it be easier to call, Sam?" asked Daniel. "She could have used an alias," O'Neill replied, with Major Carter nodding her head. "I need to do this, sir," said the Major at General Hammond. "If my daughter stayed there for some time, then maybe I could find out about her from her friends. I need you to call this officer from the Boston PD before you do anything," said the General. Major Carter nodded her head. He continued, "Find out what you can. You can leave tomorrow morning." "Sir," said the Major, "I was hoping for today." "Hop to it then," Hammond responded as Major Carter nodded her head. "Sir," Carter turned towards O'Neill, "I'm sorry about tomorrow. Don't even think about it, Carter." O'Neill waved his hand nonchalantly. "See what you can dig up on Ellie." "Thank you, sir," she replied. "General," Frazer said, "before you dismiss everyone, I would like to ask the Major if I could. She turned towards Carter and said, "I'm sorry, Sam, but I need to exhume Ellie's coffin. I know it's..." "All right," Carter said confidently. "I know that's my daughter down there in the isolation room, so I want to know who I buried. I can submit the paperwork and then the exhumation when you get back," said Dr. Frazer. Carter nodded her head. "Dismissed, people," the General said before everyone stood up. "Find what you can about Ellie, Major, and then I need you to inform Jacob." "Of course, sir," she said. To be continued.